Declaration of Independence. The New York Times Magazine says that Robert P. George is this country's most influential conservative Christian thinker. So, Robert, welcome to today's Issues.
Well, thank you, Tim and Jim. It's a pleasure to be on the show. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Robert, tell us, by the way, you are a professor at Princeton University?
That's correct.
And a visiting professor at Harvard Law School?
That's also correct.
What do they...
Guilty as charged.
Okay, what... I didn't think they allowed anybody with a conservative viewpoint in at Harvard, so they let you...
I clawed my way in. I came in under the radar screen, I guess. Well, that's actually not true. They knew what they were getting in my case. I was never in hiding.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad that they have you. That's good that they're able to give some exposure, at least, to your worldview. Talk about your new book here. It's called Conscience and Its Enemies, subtitled Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism.
Well, thanks for inviting me on to talk about the book. Conscience and Its Enemies addresses a range of contemporary issues pertaining to our public life. They're issues that are rooted in our principles. I try to show the relationship between how we ought to think about, for example, abortion, marriage, embryo-destructive research, euthanasia, affirmative action, and so forth, how we ought to think about the relationship between those issues and our fundamental principles, like the principles that you articulated by quoting the first couple of sentences of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm asking myself the question, what would our public policy look like if we were truly faithful to our principles, if we were making our public policy in line with our principles, rather than simply paying lip service to our principles and then going off and making public policy without any attention to them? The idea of conscience here is very central, and I deliberately and provocatively entitled the book Conscience and Its Enemies because I'm concerned about two different problems with respect to the concept of conscience today. One is a fundamental misunderstanding of conscience. The subtitle of the book is Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism. And one of those dogmas is the mistaken idea that conscience is a matter of feeling. It's a matter of sorting out our feelings. It's a matter of getting our actions in line with whatever it is we happen to want. This idea of conscience as a permissions department, as writing permission slips to enable us to evade the responsibilities of morality as traditionally understood, I think is quite a pernicious notion and one that's got to be confronted. And then the second concern or problem with conscience today is the willingness of cultural elites to use cultural and even political power to run roughshod over the rights of conscience that are so fundamental to our liberties as Americans. You see this most clearly, for example, in the Health and Human Services abortion drug and contraceptive mandates that would impose on employers, including religious employers, Catholic hospitals, evangelical colleges, and so forth, a requirement that they provide services or products, insurance coverage for their employees in direct contravention of their conscientiously held religious and moral beliefs. So I'm trying to ring the alarm bell about those attacks on conscience, especially as coming from the Obama administration, but it's out there beyond that as well. And I'm trying to restore the traditional idea of conscience as a stern monitor, what Cardinal Newman, the 19th century British theologian, called a stern monitor, our last best judgment informed by reflective faith and critical reason of what we are obligated to do or not do.
You're listening to today's Issues. Our guest for this half hour is Robert P. George, and we're talking about his book, Conscience and Its Enemies, Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism. Robert, in your book, one of the things you talk about could just about be taken from the headlines of the past couple of weeks, especially with last week's Supreme Court ruling. How is the destruction of family life by sexual liberalization, what is the real impact on our society?
It's devastating, and we shouldn't be surprised. All the way back in 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was then working for the Johnson administration, he would later become a Democratic United States Senator, a liberal, and he was a liberal then. Still, in 1965, as a Harvard sociologist, young sociologist working for the Johnson administration, he noticed that the out-of-wedlock birth rate in one segment of the American community, that is the African-American segment, had reached 25%. He knew that would be a catastrophe. He predicted right then and there in his famous report, the Moynihan Report, that the consequences of that for that community would be delinquency, despair, drug abuse, violence, crime, incarceration, in a vicious cycle as fatherless children produced more fatherless children, as sexual anarchy prevailed, and as the culture collapsed. At that time, Jim and Tim, the out-of-wedlock birth rate, family fragmentation birth rate, in other words, for the general population was about 5%. Fast forward to today, less than 50 years later, the out-of-wedlock birth rate in the African-American community is over 70%, and for the general population, it was 5%, it's now over 40%. Who bears the cost? Who bears the cost of these pathologies that come in the train of fatherlessness, family breakdown, cohabitation, sexual anarchy? It's not so much the rich and powerful and affluent, it's the poor who are most dependent on a healthy and vibrant marriage culture. That's why it is imperative in this country, if we care about poverty, if we care about lifting people up, if we care about having a decent society in which people can flourish, it's critical that we rebuild the marriage culture. And the Supreme Court has just done us a grand disservice by undermining the very definition of marriage, without which we will never be able to restore a healthy, vibrant, flourishing marriage culture for our young people.
I don't know, quite frankly, Robert. You mentioned the general population, unwed mothers having babies at 40. What do you say, 40%?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's...
It's a little higher than that, I'm sure, but the latest figures we have are 40%. And for those in peak childbearing years, between 18 and 35, the latest data I've seen indicate that it's now approaching 50%. It's a very bad situation. The consequences of this are exactly what Moynihan predicted they would be.
Yeah. I don't know if I've talked to many black friends and, people who work in even our movement. I just, they're just heartbroken at the state of the black family because of what you mentioned,
yes,
70+%.
And I really want to salute. There's so many good pastors, people associated, for example, with the Church of God in Christ, the largest black Pentecostal denomination in the country, who are doing magnificent work, just fighting hard in the black community and in the general population to restore marriage, to overcome fatherlessness and all the tragedies that come in the wake of fatherlessness, to restore a sense of dignity, especially for young women, to help them to avoid letting predatory men use them and abuse them. Those pastors are doing magnificent work, and we need to be supporting them. We all need to be supporting each other and standing up for each other. And the other thing is, Jim, we need to refuse to be intimidated. We need to be bold and refuse to be bullied by liberal elites, including Supreme Court justices, who tell us that if you stand for true marriage, that makes you a bigot. Well, they can call you names, but we shouldn't allow them to cow us into silence. We need to be speaking out, especially as Christians, but all Americans, but certainly especially as Christians, we need to be speaking out for what's true and just and right, and for many reasons, not the least of which is our care and responsibilities to the poor, who really do need a flourishing marriage culture to be restored.
We're talking to Robert P. George. Robert, your book is great, and it's got a lot of what we're talking about here today in it. It's called Conscience and Its Enemies, Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism. How can people get a copy of this?
Thanks again for giving me an opportunity to mention Conscience and Its Enemies and to talk about it a bit. It's available at online booksellers, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com. They have it, by the way, at a discounted price. I should point out it's not an academic book in the sense that it's hard to read or has lots of academic jargon and extensive footnotes and so forth. I've made it for a general readership. I've written this book to inform and empower people to make good arguments in the public square. I've got a Facebook page. It's Robert P. George. There's several Robert P. Georges. I'm the one, as you kindly mentioned, who's a professor at Princeton. I don't have a website of my own. I need to do that. But the book is available from all the online booksellers.
I want to let's do a brief review here of the last 50 years of American history in what on marriage and family and how we've come to this point. What happened, especially in the 50s, you had people, people began to question the Christian moral value system, especially as it related to human sexuality? You had Hugh Hefner. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's always possible to push causes back further and further and further
I
into
know.
history. You know, we could push things back into the Enlightenment and so forth. But I think there were some critical moments. One was the ultimately successful movement of Margaret Sanger to turn sexuality into a kind of recreation. She herself was associated with a movement called the eugenics movement. Her campaign for overcoming traditional Christian objections to contraception was ultimately successful. That was in the 19-teens and 20s. Then in the late 1940s, Alfred Kinsey, who was a scientist claiming to be a scientist in the field of the study of sex and sexuality, published his reports, which gained a tremendous amount of attention and were credited, and people still mouth as if they were true, so-called findings of Kinsey. It turns out it was utterly fraudulent. Kinsey was a complete fraud, but there's still such a thing as a Kinsey Institute, and they still get respect from the liberal elite. But the idea there was it undermined traditional Christian ideas about chastity, treating chastity as if it were a twisting of the personality, a kind of bad thing that led people to have hang-ups and have unhappy lives and so forth. Then in the 50s, you have the mainstreaming of pornography by Hugh Hefner. So-called soft pornography is now treated as if it's mainstream. And then all of this puts in place the predicates for the sexual revolution of the 1960s, especially what you get in 1968, the kind of rebellion against traditional norms, including those of sexuality, giving us the me generation. And I don't know, Jim and Tim, if you guys are old enough, I am to remember the me generation's imbecilic slogan, if it feels good, do it.
Right.
We're still living with the consequences of that, and the reduction of marriage from a child-centered institution, the institution that unites man and woman as husband and wife, to be father and mother to any children born of that union, to give those children the inestimable blessing of being brought up in the bond of love between their mother and their father, with both maternal and paternal contributions to their upbringing. That, of course, is replaced by the idea of marriage as mere sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, no longer really committed to permanence. It's just a union for, quote, as long as love lasts. No longer really strictly constrained by the requirements of fidelity. You get the idea of open marriages and so forth. And, of course, ultimately, then, no longer restrained by the idea of sexual complementarity. So why can't two people of the same sex have a sexual romantic partnership? Why can't 3 people or 5 people in a polyamorous ensemble?
As you were listing some of the things there, and the attack on the family and through the soft pornography and some of the things that were considered taboo then you see on TV now, where in the line of that do you think that the no-fault divorce came in on the attack of the family? Because that came about simply to relieve.
What is that exactly?
Yeah, that came about to relieve conscience.
Yeah, that's a phenomenon I think that really begins in the 1970s. It sweeps the nation. It's both a reflection and a further cause of the collapse of the marriage culture. Once you get the idea of marriage as detached from the interests of children and simply something concerned with adult satisfactions, what I called sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, then people begin to wonder, well, why should 2 people who don't want to be married be forced to be married? In fact, if one person wants out of the marriage, even if the other person wants the marriage to be sustained, why can't he get out of it just on his own initiative? And so the old idea of divorce is something that is only a last resort for the worst possible situations and something that should be avoided whenever possible for the interests of children becomes just a way out of an unhappy relationship. And when the no-fault divorce thing was being sold to the public, it was sold in part on the basis of what turned out to be a spectacular falsehood, the idea that children in marriages where the parents are quarreling would be better off with the divorce of those parents because it would take them out of that quarreling situation. Well, now we know 40 years of data and research later have shown us that that was completely untrue. If you look at the work of sociologists like Barbara Defoe Whitehead and Judith Wallerstein, the leading scholars, and Sarah McClanahan here at Princeton, you'll see that we now know that except in the very worst cases where there's abuse and so forth, kids are really badly damaged or worse off by divorce. And the introduction of no-fault divorce was really a catastrophe for the very people it was supposed to help, that is, children.